The GTX 970 is a graphics card which is tainted by controversy, but despite this, back in 2014 it was actually a very decent graphics card. A lot of people say only 3.5GB of the video memory on this GPU is usable, myself included, but I finally wanted to put these rumours to rest. That's why I've tested it against a 4GB RX 470 to finally see if the 3.5GB issue is actually an issue, and also to see which one of these graphics cards is better. The reason why I've decided to test the GTX 970 against the RX 470 is because on paper they should have very similar gaming performance. They also have 4GB of video memory, which is GDDR5, and they both have 256-bit memory buses. But the 4GB RX 470 doesn't suffer from the weird 500MB of video memory having different memory bandwidth to the rest of the frame buffer. So this should provide some insight to see if the GTX 970's weird VRAM configuration is actually causing problems in modern games. And it will also let me see which one of these GPUs is a better option in 2024. With that being said, to find out which one of these is superior, I've tested them both at 1080p in my testing PC, which has an Intel Core i5-12400F, 32GB of dual-rank dual-channel 3200MHz DDR4 memory, an MSI B660-A Pro motherboard, and a 1TB NVMe Gen 4 SSD. Both of these graphics cards have been left at the stock out-of-the-box settings, and they've both been tested with their respective latest drivers at the time of testing. So let's see if that 3.5GB issue is actually an issue, and which one of these graphics cards is better. Fortnite is the first game up today, and here we see a win in favour of Team Green, but to be fair, that doesn't really come that much of a surprise because Fortnite does favour Nvidia cards. The GTX 970 got 140fps on average with a 1% low of 98fps, whereas the RX 470 got 130fps on average with a 1% low of 100 frames per second. So the 1% low is better on the AMD card, but to be fair, that higher average is looking a bit more enticing on the GTX 970, and you do get reflex low latency as well. So either GPU, in all fairness, is totally fine for Fortnite. Hogwarts Legacy is up next, and this sees a win for the AMD card as that got 49fps on average with 38fps for the 1% low. And switching to the GTX 970, the average frame rate goes down by 8%, getting 45fps with a 1% low of 35 frames per second. So Hogwarts Legacy is not really playable on either one of these GPUs, I'd like to say, unless if you're cool with a 30fps experience. The RX 470 got a very marginal win in F123, getting 85fps on average with a pretty excellent 1% low of 73 frames per second, and the GTX 970 got 82fps on average with a 1% low of 66, so performance here in F123 is quite a bit better on the AMD card, particularly with the 1% lows. Cyberpunk 2077 sees a 4% win advantage in favour of the Nvidia card, and that doesn't come as a surprise as Cyberpunk is an Nvidia sponsored title. Even so, 47fps on average with 36 frames per second for the 1% low isn't necessarily the most playable experience in the world, and the RX 470 only netted 45fps on average with a 1% low of 33 frames per second. In all fairness, I wouldn't recommend either one of these graphics cards for Cyberpunk 2077, but the GTX 970 does score a win here. The GTX 970 bagged a massive 12% win in Spider-Man Remastered over the RX 470 4GB. Netting 68fps on average with 49fps for the 1% low means great performance on the medium preset. The RX 470 still got just north of 60fps, and the 1% low did drop down to 47fps, but performance of both of these graphics cards is totally fine. Horizon Zero Dawn on the original preset sees a very minor win for the RX 470 4GB, as that got 49fps on average with a 1% low of 41fps, and the GTX 970 trails it by 6%, getting 46fps on average with a 1% low of 38fps. Yet again, these GPUs are quite similar in Horizon Zero Dawn. Forza Horizon 5 sees a 9% performance advantage for the RX 470 4GB, as that got 65fps on average with a 1% low of 52fps, which is pretty smooth, all things considered. And the GTX 970 drops below 60 FPS on average, and the 1% low isn't looking particularly great at 48 FPS, so the RX 470 is a better card in Forza Horizon 5. The last game I'm taking a specific look at today is Doom Eternal, and on the high preset, the GTX 970 bags a massive 18% win here, getting 74 FPS on average with a 1% low of 53 FPS, which is much better than the RX 470's average frame rate of 62 frames per second. The 1% low is closer to the average with the RX 470 getting 49 FPS there, so performance isn't exactly smooth on either one of these graphics cards, but the GTX 970 absolutely wiped the floor with the AMD card in this title. Right then, overall, there is literally nothing separating both of these graphics cards in terms of the average frame rate. Like seriously, taking the average from the 11 games tested, and both of these graphics cards got the exact same score. But some games did throw out some unexpected results, like Doom Eternal heavily favoured the GTX 970, which was a big surprise to me, as I thought the memory bandwidth in this title would have hampered the GTX 970's performance, but truth be known, performance was way better on the Nvidia card. However, the RX 470 did score more lower margin wins over the GTX 970 across the 11 games tested today, and that's what closed up the performance gap between both of these graphics cards. And it also did that while consuming a lot less power, by the way, consuming 108 watts on average, when the GTX 970 consumed 181. Looking at the data, and it seems that the 3.5GB issue really isn't that much of an issue at all. I did throw some very VRAM intensive games at the GTX 970 today with Doom Eternal and Hogwarts Legacy, and they didn't even topple it. It performed totally fine. I wouldn't say any of the games performed absolutely horrible on the GTX 970, but you do have to remember this graphics card is turning 10 years old in 2024, so it's not exactly a spring chicken, and to be fair on it, I think it's aged pretty well. So if I had to choose between either one of these graphics cards, I would have to side with the RX 470, and that is because it often sells cheaper on used markets like eBay, it consumes less power, and its memory configuration, well, this isn't really that much of a win over it, but it does have a proper memory configuration. Costing me just £33, this Nitro RX 470 was actually a pretty decent deal, and I think it's got a better value than the GTX card. That is because it cost me £10 less. I'm not writing off the GTX 970 though, as it does support Nvidia's reflex low latency, so if you're an esports gamer, you're going to want that enabled, but is that worth an extra £10 over the AMD card? I'll let you decide that one. To summarise this video, I think the 3.5GB issue on the GTX 970 really isn't that much of an issue at all, and you shouldn't be concerned by it. Despite this though, the RX 470 is a better buy because it is a better value and it consumes less power, but if you're dead set on an Nvidia card, the GTX 970 isn't too bad. So if you want to see how the GTX 970 gets on, there is a video for it right up there, and there's another GPU benchmarking video right down there. And if you got this far into the video, I'd like to say thank you for sticking around this long, and if you did like the video, please leave a like, it does really help out. And with that being said, I'll catch you in the next one, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.